Dawn crept slowly across the scarred earth of the Western Front. It was late September, 1918, in the tangled fields and shattered woodlands near the Meuse River in northeastern France. The night fog still clung to the low ground like a blanket of ash, drifting through torn strands of barbed wire and over the broken ribs of trenches that had been dug and abandoned, captured and lost again over 4 years of war. The mud was thick there, black and cold, clinging to boots and rifles alike. Shell craters filled with stagnant rainwater reflected the pale sky like small mirrors scattered across the battlefield. In the distance, artillery thunder rolled in slow intervals, echoing across the hills. It was the kind of sound soldiers had grown accustomed to, the distant breathing of the war itself. 8 American soldiers moved quietly through a shallow communication trench carved into the earth. Their uniforms were stained with mud and sweat. Their helmets, newly issued only months earlier, were dented and scratched from days of marching and fighting. They were young men by any measure. Farmers from Iowa, factory workers from Pennsylvania, a railway clerk from Ohio. They had crossed an ocean to stand in a trench most of them had never heard of a year before. The rifles they carried, standard-issue M1903 Springfield rifles, were normally treated as sacred instruments of survival. A soldier protected his rifle as carefully as he protected his own life. Yet, on that quiet morning, the 8 Americans did something strange. One by one, they pushed their rifles down into the thick mud of the trench wall. They buried them, not discarded in panic, not lost in retreat, buried deliberately. Their hands worked slowly and methodically, pressing the wooden stocks into the wet soil, covering the metal barrels with clumps of dark earth. Within minutes, the weapons disappeared into the trench wall as if they had never been there at all. From the outside, it would have looked like an act of surrender or confusion. But it was neither. What the 8 soldiers were preparing for was something far more calculated. And only a few hundred yards away, 14 German stormtroopers were about to discover it. By the autumn of 1918, the First World War had reached a breaking point. For 4 years, the Western Front had barely moved. Armies had dug themselves into the earth in a massive system of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Millions of men had died fighting over distances sometimes measured in yards. But by late 1918, the balance of the war had begun to shift. The entry of the United States into the conflict in April 1917 had slowly altered the strategic equation. At first, the American presence was small. Training an army large enough for modern war required time, equipment, and organization on a scale the United States had never attempted before. Yet by the summer of 1918, that army had arrived in Europe in enormous numbers. More than 2 million American soldiers had crossed the Atlantic. Fresh divisions poured into France every month. For Germany, which had been fighting continuously since 1914, the arrival of this new force carried a psychological weight almost as heavy as its military impact. German intelligence officers studied the Americans carefully. Reports described them as enthusiastic but inexperienced. Many German commanders believed that American troops would lack the discipline and endurance of veteran European soldiers hardened by years of trench warfare. In training documents distributed among German stormtrooper units, specialized assault troops trained for infiltration tactics, American soldiers were sometimes described as energetic but naive. There was a belief among some German officers that the Americans could be shocked or outmaneuvered if attacked with speed and aggression. It was a dangerous assumption, because by September 1918, the American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing had begun participating in large-scale operations of their own. One of those operations was unfolding near the Meuse River. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive would become the largest battle ever fought by American forces up to that time. More than 1.2 million American soldiers would eventually take part. The terrain in the region was unforgiving. Dense forests, steep ridges, and deep ravines turned every advance into a struggle against both the enemy and the land itself. German defenses had been built carefully over years. Machine gun nests were hidden in concrete bunkers. Trenches were layered in complex defensive lines. Barbed wire entanglements stretched across fields like iron webs. Stormtrooper units were positioned throughout the area, trained to move quickly through gaps in enemy lines and strike with sudden violence. They were among the most experienced soldiers in the German army. Many had fought in multiple campaigns. They carried specialized weapons, grenades, pistols, light machine guns, and were trained to attack trenches with speed and coordination. The 14 stormtroopers who moved through the shattered woods that morning expected to encounter resistance. But they did not expect what they would soon see. The 8 Americans had not buried their rifles out of desperation. They were clearing space in the trench wall. Behind the thick mud, hidden beneath wooden planks and loose earth, lay several cylindrical metal tubes carefully positioned during the night. They were improvised explosive charges assembled from demolition materials commonly used by American engineers. Explosives had become one of the defining technologies of trench warfare. Artillery shells reshaped landscapes. Mines detonated beneath enemy trenches, sending entire sections of earth into the air. But smaller demolition charges, placed carefully and triggered at the right moment, could be just as devastating in close quarters. The 8 Americans had spent hours preparing their trap. They had measured distances, calculated timing, packed the explosives tightly against the trench wall facing the direction from which German patrols were most likely to approach. Their rifles had been buried simply because they would not need them for the first moments of the encounter. The weapon they intended to use first was the trench itself. As the fog lifted slightly, the 14 German stormtroopers advanced cautiously across the broken ground. They moved in short bursts, scanning the trenches ahead through the gray morning light. Their training had taught them to expect sudden fire. But the trench before them appeared strangely quiet. No rifle barrels protruded from the parapet. No movement stirred among the sandbags. The silence seemed almost unnatural. One of the stormtroopers raised a hand, signaling the others to slow their approach. They spread out slightly, stepping over shattered boards and fragments of barbed wire. Inside the trench, the 8 Americans waited, their helmets barely visible above the mud wall. Their hands rested not on rifles but on a single wire that ran along the trench floor. The wire connected the buried charges to a detonator. A small metal plunger held in the hand of the youngest soldier among them. He had been a mechanic before the war. Machines and timing came naturally to him. The German patrol reached the edge of the trench. One stormtrooper leaned forward to peer down into the narrow passage. For a moment he saw nothing but darkness and mud. Then the plunger was pressed. The explosion tore through the trench wall with violent force. The buried charges detonated simultaneously, blasting outward through the soft earth and sending a wall of debris, splintered wood, and shrapnel into the narrow space where the stormtroopers stood. The ground shook with the sudden violence of the blast. Smoke and mud erupted upward in a dark cloud. Several of the stormtroopers were thrown backward by the shockwave. Others stood momentarily frozen, stunned by the unexpected explosion. It was not simply the power of the blast that stunned them. It was the realization that the quiet trench they had approached with confidence had been transformed into a weapon itself. The 8 Americans immediately began pulling their rifles from the mud. The wooden stocks were slick with dirt but fully functional. Springfield rifles had been built with rugged reliability in mind. Their bolt-action mechanisms were simple and strong, capable of operating even in the harsh conditions of trench warfare. Within seconds, the rifles were in their hands. Shots rang out across the trench line. The stormtroopers attempted to recover their formation, but the sudden explosion had shattered their coordination. Historical accounts from the Meuse Argonne campaign describe numerous encounters where small American units used improvised tactics to disrupt German patrols and stormtrooper assaults. The battlefield environment encouraged such creativity. Trenches, craters, and shattered woods created endless opportunities for ambush. German reports from late 1918 increasingly noted the aggressive and adaptive behavior of American troops. In one intelligence summary written that October, a German officer observed that American soldiers often showed unexpected initiative in local engagements, making use of terrain and improvised devices. The small engagement near the Meuse was one of countless such moments during the final months of the war. Yet for the soldiers involved, it was unforgettable. For the German stormtroopers, the experience carried a deeper psychological shock. Stormtrooper doctrine relied on speed and surprise. They were accustomed to being the attackers, the ones who appeared suddenly out of fog and darkness to overwhelm enemy trenches. To encounter a trap so carefully prepared by an enemy they had been told was inexperienced forced an abrupt reassessment. The battlefield was changing, and the new American army was not behaving as predicted. Throughout the Meuse Argonne Offensive, similar moments occurred again and again. American units, often composed of soldiers with only months of combat experience, began demonstrating a willingness to experiment with tactics. Some used captured German grenades alongside their own. Others constructed improvised barriers and explosive traps within captured trenches. Engineering units worked rapidly to repair roads and bridges, allowing artillery and supplies to move forward despite constant shelling. The symbolic object that accompanied these soldiers across the battlefield was not only the rifle or the grenade. It was also something quieter, something more ordinary: the field ration. American soldiers carried with them standardized rations that included canned meat, hard bread, coffee, sugar, and sometimes chocolate. Compared to the increasingly strained supply situation within the German army during the final year of the war, these rations represented abundance. German prisoners captured during the Meuse Argonne campaign often commented on the quality and quantity of American food. One German soldier later wrote in a memoir that when he was first captured by American troops, he expected harsh treatment. Instead, he was handed a piece of chocolate and a cup of coffee. He wrote that the moment felt strange and confusing because it did not match the propaganda he had heard. Food became a symbol of the industrial power and logistical capacity that the United States had brought to the war. Factories across America produced enormous quantities of supplies. Ships crossed the Atlantic in constant convoys. The war that had once been fought primarily by exhausted European armies now faced the resources of a nation largely untouched by destruction at home. For German soldiers who had endured years of blockade, shortages, and rationing, the contrast could be startling. The 8 Americans in the trench that morning carried those same rations in their packs. Even as they prepared their explosives and buried their rifles in the mud, small cans of meat and wrapped pieces of chocolate rested beside them. Objects of ordinary life amid extraordinary violence. The engagement ended quickly. The surviving stormtroopers retreated into the fog, carrying their wounded with them. Inside the trench, the Americans reloaded their rifles and waited, unsure if another patrol might follow. But the quiet returned. Only the distant thunder of artillery remained. Moments like this rarely appeared in official reports. Large offensives and strategic movements dominated the historical record. Yet the war itself was built from thousands of such encounters. Small decisions made by soldiers in muddy trenches far from the attention of generals. Each moment shaped perceptions. Each moment carried its own lessons. For the German soldiers who had approached that silent trench expecting an easy assault, the explosion in the mud became a reminder that the war had entered its final, unpredictable phase. For the Americans who had set the trap, it was proof that they could stand alongside the veteran armies of Europe. The Meuse Argonne Offensive would continue for weeks. It would cost the United States more than 26,000 lives. Entire hillsides would be taken and retaken under relentless artillery fire. Yet the offensive gradually pushed German forces backward. Supply lines weakened. Morale declined. By November 1918, the German government began seeking an armistice. The war that had begun with confidence and patriotic enthusiasm across Europe ended in exhaustion and uncertainty. On the morning of November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The trenches that had consumed millions of lives became quiet for the first time in 4 years. In the years that followed, veterans from both sides would remember small details from the war more vividly than the grand strategies. The smell of wet earth in a trench, the metallic click of a rifle bolt, the sudden roar of an unexpected explosion, and sometimes the taste of chocolate handed to a captured enemy. Objects and moments that seemed insignificant at the time took on symbolic meaning later. The buried rifle in the mud, the hidden charge in the trench wall, the field ration carried across an ocean. Each became a fragment of a larger story. A story about how industrial power, improvisation, and human endurance shaped the outcome of the war, and about how soldiers, whether American or German, experienced those forces not through political speeches or maps, but through the mud beneath their boots and the sudden thunder of a trench exploding beneath the morning fog. Because in the end, wars are remembered not only through victories and defeats, but through the quiet moments before the blast. The seconds when soldiers pause, listening to the silence, unaware that the ground beneath them has already been prepared to change everything.